Hello, everyone, and welcome to another presentation in the World History 2 class. Today we're going to be talking about Enlightenment, sort of continuing and looking at the responses to the Age of Absolutism, which we talked about last class. So as we saw last time in class, in terms of government within Europe, most monarchies having a king or a queen during the 16 and 1700s, most of these empires in Europe began to have much more centralized power. And by centralized power, I mean in the hands of one or just a few. And this really spoke to the idea that this was a time in which monarchies had absolute power, in which no one could sort of tell the king or queen no, or have power over them to stop them from doing stuff that they wanted to do. And so these empires started to grow more and more as well, growing from just sort of like regional, smaller territories to a lot of the countries that we know today in terms of their current forms. And so, really the reason why this was happening was as a response to some of the things that we talked about last class. So we talked about religious wars like the 30 Years' War, which we mentioned back in the Reformation unit. And these religious wars would, cause sort of a disruption to society and also signaled sort of a falling of power for the Catholic Church. And within that vacuum, within that space in which that power used to exist, a lot of these kings would step up and sort of claim that power for themselves individually. Another reason was secularism. So that divide between religious and uh, political life or religious and really any other aspect of society started to become much better separated. And then the last one was the end of the feudal system or the end of feudalism in Europe, in which these smaller nobles would sort of control a lot of the land and people would sort of just work this land for very little money. And so out of this feudal system that was held by a lot of smaller nobles that would sort of control certain parts of land, uh, came a king who oversaw all of that land by themselves, or a queen that oversaw all of that land. And so rulers across Europe are really existing in this time in which they don't have anyone else that they sort of have to answer to. And so we start to see, and so what we see is that people like our friend King Louis XIV here, they get more and more wealthy and more power, in which you see right here just how wealthy he is. Obviously, some symbols of power there in terms of the size of his sword, or the amount of very nice linens that he has, very nice clothes, and the palaces like the Palace of Versailles that ends up getting built within France within this time period. And all of this, without having anyone to tell them no to this. And so out of this age of absolutism, some people start to question uh, what the role of government is and whether one person should have all of this power. And this grew out of some of the other intellectual movements that we've talked about this far this year, right? Like the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment started to question some of these questions about humanity itself. And so the Enlightenment, if we're looking for a definition, it's really an intellectual and cultural movement that starts in the 1700s that ends up emphasizing the idea of using reason and science over just blind faith or superstition. And a lot of these ideas were built on what was talked about in the scientific revolution. And so questions about the rights of man, the role of government, the role of religion within society, uh, and what role all of these play in terms of what our rights are as human beings. And this really represents a revolution in thinking, and that's going to be the third part of this unit that we really focus in on. So here we can see just a couple pictures from this time of the Enlightenment, and you can see, public forums being made on some of the ideas being expressed, people circling around tables, discussing some of these really important ideas that a lot of humans in the generations before that had just sort of taken for granted. They did not feel like it was in their power to even, hold any reins of power. And so we're starting to see those being questioned in terms of how Europe is running things and how the world runs itself. And so really the beginnings of the Enlightenment, if we're sort of taking a step back and looking at it overall, among these questions that Enlightenment thinkers start to really question uh, was really ideas, like I said on the last slide, that had not been questioned because a lot of these teachings had come from the Catholic Church and then from kings and queens who had sort of stepped up into the power that the Catholic Church once held. And so among the chief of these ideas that starts to be questioned is the idea of divine right. And so this was the belief that the king or queen ruled because God was on their side. God had given them this power and had chosen them. And so it wasn't the responsibility of people to question their leadership because God had entrusted them to be the leader. And a lot of Enlightenment thinkers started to question this because people started to see that in this age of absolutism, we don't really have as much power as we want and believe we should have. And people are becoming much more educated and starting to question some of the, what used to be considered truths within society. And so because people are questioning this, the idea of natural rights, rights that are guaranteed to all people, um, and these are commonly phrased as life, liberty, and property, the three natural rights. And this, definition has of course grown over time, but they wanted to control their own lives. And so moving away from divine right and saying, no, the government and the king and queen are there to protect those natural rights. They are not there to do whatever they want. They are not, there in the minds of some who are secular because God wanted them to be. And so the third idea that starts to come that's of great importance is the social contract. And so this is where they began to state that the government had to protect the rights of people. They had to protect life, liberty, and property. And if that was not happening, that citizens had a right to change the government. And so that's where that contract comes in. It's an agreement between the government and the people. The government takes care of your rights. The people follow the government and, come together for a more peaceful society. But if the government is not holding up their end, then the people have a right to change that government. And so, as Enlightenment thinkers start to become more and more popular, the idea of absolute monarchy starts to become questioned more and more, right? The idea that absolute monarchs have this complete authority, that people like Louis XIV have complete authority, and that God is on their side, this starts to become louder and louder and louder that maybe this isn't quite right. And so some of these important, Enlightenment thinkers, just to give us a few examples, one was Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, and he sort of was on a different spectrum in terms of what he believed human beings were capable of. And he argued that people really needed government to protect them from themselves. And this is because he felt like, when left to our own devices without sort of an authority figure, we were too violent, too primitive, and we would sort of destroy each other. The second one was John Locke, and they wrote that John Locke wrote that people gave their consent to the government to rule them in return for the protection of their natural rights of life, liberty, and property as well. And we can see in here not only, obviously the important thing that he made was natural rights and defining these. And if you think back to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson uses the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this comes directly from John Locke, who really inspired a lot of the founding fathers of the United States. The next one, the Montesquieu, he wrote that the best form of government had a separation of powers, which again the United States then used. So legislative, executive, and judicial branch, sort of spreading that power from just in the hands of one person. And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, obviously a Frenchman, the author of The Social Contract, and really popularized and continued to formalize this idea that government had a contract with the ruler and the people, and if that is not followed, the people again have a right to rebel against that government. And then finally, in the last one here is Voltaire. This is an author who focused on the separation of church and state. And obviously this is a much more secular rule. They're clearly trying to define that difference between the church and the government, the church and society. And he really was someone that argued for religious tolerance over time, and then ended up taking aim at a lot of religious and political authority figures. So we see here again just some of the quotes made by some of these men. And I would suggest reading these over. I think, there's a lot of lessons within them about who these men were and what they believe. All right, so just some final thoughts here. So if we're thinking about the word enlightenment, to enlighten means to turn on a light, okay? And a lot of these ideas turned on the light. No longer were people just passively sort of sitting back and not sort of questioning the government and the power that they wielded over people or what they could do or what the point of government was. But all of these ideas in some way led to new ways of thinking about government and society. And these ideas were really the foundation for both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. As these ideas become more and more popular, and as you start to look around and see all of the rights that you may not have and that are not being protected, well, then people are starting to say we should fight for these rights. We have a natural right. We are born with these rights to do this. And so if we're looking at our own country, the United States, many of the founding fathers, for instance, use these as a basis for leaving England, who was our colonizer at the time, uh, and becoming an independent country. And so we see these ideas throughout the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so many other foundational documents of the country. And not only does it spread to what would become the United States, but also these ideas are not even questioned anymore in terms of whether they are to be protected in a lot of ways. Certain movements might start to think about these ways in different ways, but these ideas have really become fundamental to many governments around the world today, and we're often quite shocked when these things aren't protected. And coming from this age of absolutism, that was certainly not the case. Very, very revolutionary in their ideas.